Yes, my name is Mahmood Ahmad. I again work for Water Center here at LAMS. We are contributing a series of lectures on this course on Introduction to Environment Sciences, right? Yeah. So I think in this one we have already given a full-fledged lecture on the subject on economics of environmental sciences. I think still we got a feedback from the participants that some of the concepts need to be highlighted or clarified. So this is on our part is an attempt to release some of the concepts we think are very commonly used in environmental economics. We will try to bring more clarity to those concepts. Now, let me introduce Tabeer, who was also with me in the first lecture. She will give a brief introduction to the environmental economics, and then I will take up to more really practical aspects of the terminology used in resource economics and environmental economics.
Assalamu alaikum. I will start with the presentation. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Now I'll start with the presentation. So I'm going to share the basic concepts of the economics which we have used in our previous lecture. And I'm going to link the environment with the economy. As you can see, the environmental view of the economic activity, this is how environment links with the economics. So economics receive inputs from the environment that enable human society to function, which is very clearly visible in this diagram. Ecosystem services support the life that makes economic activities possible. So environmental economists see the human economy as within the environment, receiving resources and services from it. So if we look at the goods and services which are provided through the ecosystem, so the natural resources are the goods that we get from our environment. And if we look at the services that nature performs for free, include soil formation, water purification, climate regulation, pollination, nutrient cycling, and waste treatment. So these are the goods and services which ecosystem provides us. So in general, this approach to the environment is concerned with market failure, inappropriate resource allocation, and how to manage public goods. There was a little concern for the underlying relationship between the economy and the environment. So the environmental economists view the environment as a form of natural capital, which forms a lot of functions like life support, amenity, and other functions that cannot be supplied by man-made capital. This stock of natural capital includes natural resources plus ecological systems, land, biodiversity, and other attributes of the environment. So this is a very interesting chart which shows that how we can make our environment sustainable. As environment sustainable is concerned with whether environment resources will be protected and maintained for our future generations. If we look at the first thing that how we can make our environment sustainable, it's that we need to shift to renewable resources. Like we need to limitize the consumption of non-renewable resources. Secondly, we need to protect the health of our ecosystems. Avoid ecosystems becoming irreparably damaged. We also need to avoid excess pollution. Pollution can cause damage to health and the Earth's atmosphere. And intergenerational decisions. Make economic decisions based on long-term consequences. And the most important, we need to target welfare, not GDP. Value measures of economic and social welfare more than GDP. Now I will just briefly go through over the basic concepts of economics, demand, supply, and market equilibrium, which are the very basic concepts in economics. So if we look, we can look on the diagram, and the concept behind demand is that for a given product, it can be a good or service. The market demand depicts the price buyers are willing to pay for a specified quantity provided in the market at that point of time, with holding all other factors constant. That we can see through the diagram. So in market supply shows, other things being equal, the minimum price that producers in aggregate are willing to pay to accept in order to provide a given quantity of a product in the market at a given point in time. So the major difference that we can see in the both graphs is that if we increase the price in demand, the quantity will decrease, and it's vice versa. If we increase the price in supply, the suppliers would be more willing to produce that product, or will be more willing to supply that product. So now, how the market reaches its equilibrium? If we look that there is some price where the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied equals, that price is known as the equilibrium price. So this is how the market equilibrium price and quantity is reached. So these are the very basic concepts of the economics. Now we will look at the marginal cost and marginal benefit. So in economics, the marginal cost of production is the change in total production cost that comes from making or producing one additional unit. A marginal benefit is a maximum amount a consumer is willing to pay for an additional good or service. So if we look in the perfect markets for regular goods and services, goods are produced at the point where the cost to society of producing the last unit, which is the marginal cost, as I have already explained, is just equal to the amount consumer is willing to pay for the last unit. That is the marginal benefit, which means that the net benefits in the market are maximized. So after this, we will look at the opportunity cost, which is also a very known term used in economics. When economists refer to the economic opportunity cost of a resource, they mean that value of the next highest valued alternative use of that resource. So economists use opportunity cost to properly weigh their decisions in order to make smart decisions. For example, in environmental economics, we take the example of environment. The economic cost of chopping down a forest is not just the cost of employing labor and machinery to do the job, but also includes the cost of lost opportunities to use the forest for alternative purposes, such as for recreation. It can be used to provide other environmental benefits. So we will just take another example in the case of non-renewable resources, that like oil, metals. The opportunity cost is the value of the ecosystems that will be harmed throughout the life cycle of the raw materials. There are many other examples that we can take from the environment. One, we have already discussed the opportunity cost of water in our previous lecture. So now Dr. Mahmood will further continue with the basic concepts of the environmental economics, or you can say the advanced concepts of the environmental economics.
Okay,
One second.
इसका heading देने की जरूरत नहीं है.
Where
We
is
can start from
the meeting window? अच्छा, back to meeting.
फिर क्या बोल दोबारा?
Dr. Mahmood, you know better than me how to operate this.
नहीं वो okay.
हम ये will edit this one कि ये जो हम conversation कर रहे हैं.
ये रिकॉर्ड हो रही है?
हाँ, रिकॉर्ड तो हो रही है, लेकिन हम इसको वो कर लेंगे. Inbox, this is
नहीं, इसको तुम आई थिंक जाके ना फिर एक दो जरा किसको कैसे पॉज कैसे करना है और
बैक टू मीटिंग. ये है ना हमारी मीटिंग. तो
स्लाइड शो देखो, स्लाइड शो में जाओ.
where is slideshow?
ये रेड वन.
This one? ये तो stop share है ना.
अच्छा.
Okay, stop. Oh, simple. ठीक है. अभी मैं pause. Resume.
Yes, as I said in the introduction that we'll have two parts of our presentation. The first part was done by Tabeer. She introduced the basic economic concept. So I will try to highlight the basic concepts used in environmental economics. Before I really set the stage, I would like to really give an overall view of all the stakeholders that are involved in this environmental economics, or I have given it the title, How to Incorporate Environmental Concerns into Decision Making. So I think if you look closely at the top, then this defines us the environmental systems. Then I think another red, which is analytical tools and methods. And finally, socioeconomic. Again, coming back to the environmental system, we have a set of resource base, which is global, transnational, like air. Air does not have any boundaries. Then the natural habitats, like forest is a good example. Land, I don't want to give an example, you all know it, and so is the water. And finally, which is my picture is holding really, is the urban air quality, these kind of things. So all these things really, or components, make the environmental system. And then I think if we look at the analytical tools available and methods, again, we have three categories. One is the environmental assessment. Second is the environmental economic analysis. And finally, the conventional environment, finally, the conventional economic analysis. Going back to the environmental assessment, we have three components in it. Always analysis takes us to physical, biological, and social impact. I think this part has already been fairly covered in the course, so I'm not going to highlight much of it really. I think to me the most important is the next one, which is environmental economic analysis. Some of the commonly tools used are environmental impact assessment, which is done at the project level. I think we at LUMS are already moving into a project where we have already done some work on the nature-based agriculture at a pilot level. So we are trying to see if we can upscale this to look at the impact both at the project level, at the regional level, at the national level. The next is the integrated resource management. I think this is a very important aspect that has been around for a while, where we really, taking the case of water, which I work most of the time, is that integrated approach means is that water is not the domain only of engineers. It is a multidisciplinary domain which involves economists, environmentalists, sociologists, and other disciplines. Then another interesting area in environmental economics, which we are also trying to get into, is environmental macroeconomic analysis and environmental accounting. I have been involved in doing some work on the water accounting, but I think what we are trying to do now is to move our focus also on the environmental aspects. And I think myself and Tabeer, we will soon start a project on dairy and hopefully also on rice, where we will try to do a proper environmental accounting. What means is that we will try to estimate the carbon balance. Then, of course, the global environmental analysis is again very important because, as I said, that environment don't have any boundaries, whether it is air, groundwater, or others. I think this is the table or a graph which I updated. The original author of this table did not include this new, which I call it health economic nexus, environment nexus. I think this is a new game in town, and it is going to be there because a lot of these new health issues, there is a trade-off being worked between health first or economic first. So I think we are going to see in the cost of climate change. Then I think the next is conventional economic analysis. Again, here I will not really cover because these are the traditional tools, which is cost benefit analysis, sectoral and subsectorial analysis, national macro analysis, international economic analysis, and climate smarting. The final is the socio-economic structure. All these things have to have impact, both at the project level, at the regional level, at the national macro level, international level, and more so now in the international level, as the recent pandemic is showing us. We move to the next slide. Shuru kar दूं? Yes, having given that broader framework, so I would like to really introduce some of the basic concept used in resource economics. So again, given the time, we'll not be able to cover all of them. This is some of the list I have created: supply and demand analysis, which Tabeer has very briefly presented. So is the marginal cost and marginal revenue, social marginal cost and social marginal revenues. Then I think we have to have the optimal solutions. We will also briefly touch on it. Then we look at how these effective markets work, what are the conditions required. Again, the concept of market failure and externality is very important. And finally, we will also try to introduce the sustainable concept of sustainable development, highlighting some of the work we are doing. I think this has already been covered really, so I'm not going to, let's move to the next slide. So I think in my last lecture, I also tried to really summarize some of the economic instruments for environmental protection and natural resource management. Broadly speaking, they can be classified under property rights, market creation, fiscal instrument, and charges system. Again, I think to me, the most important from our perspective are property rights and fiscal instruments. Again, within the property rights, ownership rights and use rights. Again, we have a number of forward-looking instruments, which is market creation, fiscal instrument, taxes and subsidies, and charges system, which is the polluters pay principles and things like that. Then I think of all the list I showed before, given the short span of time, two concepts are very important, which are very key concepts in environmental and natural resource management. One is the externality, and the second is market failure. I think we will try to highlight or clarify as much as possible. It will be a tough job because it takes a lot of effort with practical examples and case studies to make it understand. Again, environmental market failure can be divided into two categories. One is the classical environmental externality, which we can find a lot in our economic textbooks. But then there is the environmental degradation, which also takes place, is less covered really in our literature. What environmental externality means is it can be positive or it can be negative or positive. When it is negative, it arises when the producer or consumer imposes cost on others for which the imposers cannot be charged. So I am polluting it and I can't be charged. That's a negative externality. Then, on the other hand, producer or consumers create benefits. Now, I am creating benefits for a certain activity for which I am not being compensated. So these are the two very important concepts which one can estimate. Then from our perspective, it is equally important, the environmental degradation. Um, I can run examples after examples. Most classical overuse of physical resources like soil, water, air, and forest by producers and consumers. An example, farmers growing irrigated rice using tube well to tap underground water aquifers gradually deplete them, reduce the capacity of the soil to remove salts. So these are the classical example, and there are so many of others which we can cite. Then policy tools, these were the externalities. So what are the policy tools available to address the externality? The most commonly used is command and control. Most common approaches involve setting physical limits, either production or treatment levels. But then there are other tools ranging from half-heartedly used to some of the new tools being developed. The other is taxes and subsidies. Now, the one I highlighted the positive and negative externalities. For that, the instrument we use is taxes and subsidy, used for negative and positive externalities respectively. Taxes and subsidies should reflect the marginal external cost or benefits in order to induce changes in their production. Now, some of the recent policy innovation are developing market for externalities. This is an area of considerable interest to us, especially in the water sector and more so also on the environment, really, pollution control. Creating tradable property rights in pollution permits, number one, by allowing offsets for treatment, by creating differential fees for production, by implementing environmental charges and rebates. Then the second concept, which I said in the beginning, is the market failure. The market failure. The market failure can be defined, it occurs when the markets are not functioning of the environment, and it's lead to situation in which cost of environmental damage is not fully recovered. I think two concepts are equally important. One is a public good, is a case where government provision of these goods is the most common. Government provision of these goods is the most common. A good example of such a public good is national defense or public safety. However, pricing and paying for the good is problematic. The second is the natural monopoly. Two approaches are possible. First is to grant a monopoly right, but regulate the price charge. Public utilities are examples. Then to show that the markets are contestable, that is, that other producers are free to enter if they desire. Then there is another concept which is very much useful in our context, especially the groundwater, is the common property. Groundwater and fishing is a classical case. Impose taxes, what we do to address the issue of common property. We can impose taxes equal to marginal cost of overuse. These most often involve marginal user cost, but may also include external cost. Establishing rights to certain amounts of use or limiting the access to the resource such as fishing licenses. Many of the rights or licenses are tradable on the market. Now, this is a very interesting table, which is it's called the 10 Rending developed the following. It was developed by Rendell, a matrix where we have two attributes of effective markets. One is the exclusivity, and second is the rivalability. I'm a little bit pronouncing it's not really coming out straight. Exclusivity, what it means? Ability to prevent others from using the good in question. So I have a right, I can prevent Tabeer. You don't have the right to use it. It's my right. Right? In non-inclusive, if opposite is true, if this is not true, yes, I can use, she can use it equally. Then there is another classification. A good is hyper-inclusive if agent can bargain with each individual who would like to obtain a unit of good as opposed to selling unit of good at a single price. So I have a number of buyers interested, and I really have the right, so I can negotiate with them, with different people, the different price to give them the right. The other important component or definition is rivalability, which is the effect of consumption of good by one agent on the availability of the good to the others. Fishery is a good example. A good is non-rival if consumption of one unit of good does not diminish the availability of good to the others. Example is scenery. If I have I can see it scenery, you can also see it, and I think it will not diminish it really. So I think it is rival if consumption does not reduce the availability. A good example is candy bar. So this is another kind of example. Again, the next one is more interesting. It is congestible. If a non-rival over some level of use, but rival on the other side. Road is a good example. Somewhere I think you have road, you are running free and there's no competition. And then you come to all of a sudden a congestion. And I think that's a different ball game. Going back to really to summarize all these attributes, Randall put together this matrix where we have all these exclusivity on one side, which is non-inclusive, exclusive and hyper-exclusive, and rivalability, non-rival, congestible, and rival. And they have to be, one of them has to be in these categories. It can be a pure public good, it can be a common property, it can be a market good, it can carry a monopoly. So these are the categories, and I think this is, there is extensive literature available covering this, because this distinction is very important in terms of, property rights or market rights. Now, finalizing the economics part, I think this is something probably a graph which is so close to my heart, because that's based on it. I wrote a paper in Water Policy Journal, and I think it was published, and it's one of the most cited paper right now, where I made a case that water, the problem of water scarcity, groundwater depletion, siltations, and all these blah, blah, are just the symptoms. The real cause is a combination of policy failure, institutional failure and market failure. That is something I learned from Dr. Paniato, who is the director of environmental program at Harvard. We did together a course in Cyprus. So where he showed us that the case of both water and some of the other environmental goods is that, first of all, there is a policy failure. Policy failure, as Tabeer highlighted, that this is the price farmers are paying for water, and this is what the quantity they are using, right? So this entails a subsidy. The subsidy part I can highlight is that a rough calculation of subsidy for water can be that, okay, the price of water which the farmers are paying for canal water is just really 150 rupees per acre. But what farmers are paying for selling the same water to its next neighbor is almost 10 to 15 times more. So that represents that how much, underpricing we have done it for the water. So the first step would be to move this curve back to here, where we can remove the policy failure. Then this is not it. There's other distortions, which we call it unaccounted social costs here. Which are those? Number one is institutional failure, because I can just read it. Such an open access and insecure tenure reduce the user benefit from conservation of depletable resources and remove the marginal user or depletion cost. So it's essentially the depletion cost. And I think in this case, groundwater is a classical case. We have open access, everyone can put a tube well, and he can really pull out as much water as he can, but this cost is not accounted for. But somewhere in the society, we as a taxpayer are paying for it. Then finally, there is another cost which we have discussed, which is called the market failure. Again, these are actually the environmental externalities which we discussed before, including the pub. That's why I was trying to highlight some of those concepts to show you this graph, that some of these, first of all, we have to really address the issue of huge subsidy we are paying. So then I think why we are using the resource at a no cost. At the top of it, the resources we are using it today are not available for our future generations. Then I think all the environmental costs, which are we also don't want evaluate, is now becoming more and more obvious, and now most of these our health issues are being now attributed to. So I think it is very important for economists to provide this kind of analysis where we remove this subsidy, we take into account for the user cost and also the environmental cost. So that was at this price, we were really producing this. But if we look at the new price, this will be the price. People will pay more for resource use and its misuse, and then we will be using less of that commodity. So what I have tried to highlight for this, there is so much the work we are doing it on our analytical side, that if anyone is interested, we can really have a look. Again, a summary of government intervention, institutional instruments, property rights, research and information, command and control. then economic instrument, prices, taxes, and subsidies. Then innovation instrument, tradable permits rights, quotas, differential fees, offset, environmental check. So some of them are very relevant to our resource use and addressing some of these policies. So this is in brief, is summarized the different tools used in environmental economics. Very briefly, I will introduce the concept of sustainable development, which is very much related. What we are trying, why we are trying to price, my last graph was, we call this as full cost pricing, that we have to really take all the components of the cost into. Why we are doing it? To really come up with a sustainable. One of the instrument is to use pricing as a sustainable. Sustainably means whatever development occurs can itself in the long term. There are about 15, and some of these, goals set by sustainable development goals that are related to environment and sustainable natural resource space are highlighted there. Those they are pretty much available in some of these standard documents of UN. Then I think this is very briefly, we are going to really highlight some of the work we are doing it here at LUMS, where we have identified two farming system, which is one is we attribute to it as unsustainable, and I think the other is sustainable. Tabeer, in her last presentation, you briefly presented the results, but just to highlight the application of some of those concepts here is very important. So I think the unsustainable production system was using all of the environmental polluting inputs. At the same time, it was using too much water. And we recorded their output or yields. Then I think we also introduced a sustainable model with modifying some of the practices which farmers are doing at the present, and bringing in some of the training to the farmers and adopting some of those practices with absolutely no pesticide, very little fertilizer, far less water, and at the same time we were able to obtain a much higher yield. So that created a really win-win situation from the environmental perspective, and we showed how some of these economic instruments which we can use it can make farming number one, profitable, competitive, more important, sustainable, and inclusive, because the model we use could be used for all kind of level of farmers, or all size of the farmers. Again, to give a little bit of big perspective, this is based on the lecture series. Myself and Dr. Professor Keith of Utah University, very well-known environmental economist. We did it in different training courses around the world, and we tried to develop some kind of a matrix that linking the sustainability with policy and markets. Very quickly, what entails a successful policy? Again, categorizing some of the tools, how we can fit them in. A successful policy would entail secure property rights, long-term leases and licenses, then taxing of negative externality, then subsidy of positive externality, pricing of unpriced public good, reduce impediments to exchange, and ensure contestability. Then these are successful policy. What are the successful attributes of successful market? Secure of rights, price reflect the social cost. Remember on that optimal full cost pricing? So it was reflecting the social cost. Then low transaction cost, the cost of doing business, competitive market. So these are some of the attributes of successful. These characteristic prices of resource rise to reflect this. At the end, this should show like this. Prices of resource rise reflect scarcity. Think about it, that do some of the resources we are using it, do their prices reflect the scarcity? Absolutely not. Efficiency, physical, economic increases, substitution increase, conservation encouraged, investment encouraged. Another attribute, which is one was the market, the other is policy failure. Again, what are the attributes of policy failure? So I have summarized all the concept we have highlighted, that where they fit in terms of our decision making process. Policy fair property subject to expropriation / uncertainty, short-term leasing, then subsidies for capital investment, subsidies for energy, subsidies for resources. I highlighted the case of water. Subsidies for pollutant use. Then there is again instrument tax holidays that impose high transaction costs, granting monopolies, quota, interest rates, and regulation and price lag. Again, those were policy failures. Market failure, insecure property rights, no incentive for conservation. Price reflect only price costs. Remember, we have to shoot towards the social costs, low efficiency. Many public goods, many common properties, monopolistic production, price do not reflect the cost, few incentive to invest in substitute. Again, final comments. What happens if we have this policy failure and market failure? The attributes of the economy come slow or no growth. I think these are very prevalent in some of our really past history of 40, 50 years. Poverty to increase, rapid population growth, resource to be depleted rapidly, environment quality to decline quality. So all these attributes, think about it, where we place ourselves. I think most of these attributes, if we look closely, fit in very well to our case. I think I will like to end here because this is the case study. Last time already Tabeer highlighted it. I think this is in brief, we try to introduce the concepts and in a larger context, how they fit these tools in different policy making and decision making calculus. Thank you very much. And I think this completes our two-part series.
So, any final comments?
No, we are very thankful. I enjoyed working with this group, really, not only making two presentations, but also attending some of the course. And I think this was a good bunch of kids who really articulated us. And I think if anyone is interested, some of the interesting work we are doing, they are most than welcome to join. And I think especially the nature-based agriculture and carbon balance we are planning to calculate, they are all relevant to what you have been taught.
And I would also like to say thanks to Dr. Fauzi and Dr. Mahmood for giving me this opportunity, as I'm also in the learning phase, being a researcher at Water Center. So thank you, Dr. Fauzi and Dr. Mahmood.
Yeah, I think I am also, I think I have already really acknowledged Dr. Fauzi for the excellent really platform of the very interesting group. We had very interesting